gosh, making sure you're okay. Oh boy, this one's so small. 1 Kings 17 to 24. Man. Let's see. Sometime later, the son of the woman who owned the house became ill. He grew worse and worse. He finally stopped breathing. She said to Elijah, "What do you have against me, man of God? Did you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son?" "Give me your son," Elijah replied. He took him from her arms and carried him to the upper room where he was staying and laid him on his bed. Then he cried out to the Lord, "O Lord my God, have you brought tragedy also upon this widow I'm staying with by causing her son to die?" Then he stretched himself out on the boy 3 times and cried to the Lord, "O Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him." The Lord heard Elijah's cry, and the boy's life returned to him, and he lived. Elijah picked up the child and carried him down from the room into the house. He gave him to his mother and said, "Look, your son is alive." And then the woman said to Elijah, "Now I know that you are a man of God, and the word of the Lord from your mouth is truth." Clearly it's time for either bifocals or large print Bible. Luke 7:11 to 17. Not long afterward, Jesus went to a town called Nain. His disciples went with him, and so did a large crowd. As he got near to the gate of the city, a young man was being carried out, dead. He was the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. There was a substantial crowd of townspeople with her. When the master saw her, he was very sorry for her. "Don't cry," he said to her. Then he went up and touched the bier, and the people carrying it stood still. "Young fellow," he said, "I'm telling you, get up." The dead man sat up and began to speak, and he gave him to his mother. Terror came over all of them. They praised God. "A great prophet has risen among us," they said. "God has visited his people." This report went out about him in the whole of Judea and the surrounding countryside.
All right, thanks so much. Thank you all for coming out this morning. It's good to see everybody. It's good to be seen, too. So I'm glad I'm here, too. So the 2 lectionary texts for this morning are similar stories, one from the Old Testament, one from the New, about 2 widows who had sons that both passed away, and they were both raised from the dead. One at Elijah's hands and one at Jesus' hands. And so there's some interesting comparing and contrasting that we can do with these 2 stories. But first I want to talk a little bit about personal prophecy. Everybody knows what that is, right? Most of us have been in churches that practice personal prophecy, or prophetic ministry, we might call it. It's where somebody ministers a word of the Lord to someone else. I think there can be some real value in that. People can be edified, exhorted, lifted up, encouraged, inspired through prophetic ministry. I've seen people who were really afraid of doing what they felt for years in their heart that they should do, become inspired to do. I've seen people start businesses that they always wanted to start, but they never felt like they were good enough or that it might work. And somebody in a prophetic ministry session touched on that thing, and they went ahead. So lots of good experiences in prophetic ministry. We in our churches in the past would often practice that. We trained people in how to do that in a way that would not harm people, not go beyond the bounds of too directive of prophecies. I told people I don't want anybody prophesying babies to people, and I don't want anybody prophesying moving to Swahili or something like that to people. I think we can get in a lot of trouble with those kind of personal prophecies. We often would bring in ministers that ministered in personal prophecy. We would have a lot of visitors come oftentimes to those meetings, hoping to get a personal prophecy. And I've had meetings with people after those meetings, really angry that the prophet didn't call them out for a prophecy. They felt like if they made the effort to come out to the meeting, he should give them a word. And I said, well, I don't control him. He chooses who he feels like God has a word for. And On the other hand, we also had some people in our own church who would never come out to those special meetings. And I think they had various reasons, but one of the reasons that I heard was some people didn't want to come out because they were afraid that the prophetic minister might read their mail, they called it. Call out or bring to light something in their life that they didn't want brought to light. And I was careful to teach our prophetic ministers not to do that. That's not a healthy thing to do. And as far as I know, most of the prophetic ministers we had that came in didn't do that or tried not to. So some people wouldn't come out at all. That kind of an environment, though, and I spent some time in Assembly of God churches where the resident prophet in the congregation was nearly every service you could count on them to come up with some kind of a directive prophecy towards somebody that if you knew the people in the congregation, you could tell who it was for, even though it wasn't spoken directly at them. It was they'd blast the whole congregation with it. And you could see how it can be misused. It can cause fear in people. That was what some people that wouldn't come out to these meetings were functioning in. They were afraid that the prophet would call something to attention or bring something to light that they were ashamed of or that they didn't want other people to know about. An environment where people thought their sins either disqualified them from God's love, or that if their sins were revealed, it would cause God to be angry with them or their friends to be angry with them, and that God might bring a hammer down on them. This is kind of the thinking that we see in the first widow story, the widow of Zarephath in 1 Kings. Let me back up and give you a little bit of commentary. Elijah had been directed by God to go to Zarephath. When he got there, a widow met him, and he asked the widow to make him a little cake. And she said only had a tiny bit of grain left and a little bit of oil, and she told Elijah, I was just going to go and make a cake for me and my son. We were going to eat it and die. Well, what was she talking about? Well, they were in the midst of a drought. This is the same context as last week when we were talking about the prophet of Baal story. So this is the same drought. She's in this drought, and she only has a tiny bit of resources left, and she was planning on eating that with her son and starving to death. Elijah asks her to go and make him a cake out of the material, the ingredients she had. She did that, brought it to him, and then from then on, it says till the end of the drought, she was not without grain or oil. So she was miraculously cared for. And then the text right after that is where Sherry Ann read this morning. After this, the son of the woman, the mistress of the house, became ill. His illness was so severe that there was no breath left in him. She then said to Elijah, what have you against me, O man of God? You have come to me to bring my sin to remembrance and to cause the death of my son. That's the same kind of attitude I saw with some people in person. They didn't want to be around somebody that functioned in prophetic ministry because they were afraid just being in the proximity of that person would draw God's attention to their sin or to their what was wrong in their life. This way of thinking, I have sinned, and because of that, God's going to get even. He's going to get his pound of flesh and take something that's precious from me, still is prevalent in the world today and in the church today. But it's the basis for sacrificial thinking and the basis for sacrificial religion, which my title today talks about the subversion of sacrificial religion, and we'll see it played out in these two stories. The idea is that my sin has angered God, and I must do something to turn God's anger away from me, and a sacrifice is that thing. That's what everybody thought back in the ancient Near East. That's how it worked. This way of thinking, though, words phrases like John 3:16. You know that passage, right? For God so loved the world that he gave his only son. This kind of thinking, if you think about it, rewords that to God was so angry with the world that he sent his only son. But that's not what John tells us. John tells us that God has a different posture toward the whole world. It's not a posture of burning anger. It's not a posture of, you've got to please me or I'm going to take something from you that's of value to you. Don't let a prophet or minister come too close. That's how a lot of people think, because they carry the presence of God, and God is a fearsome being. we want to push back against that idea a little bit. The widow of Zarephath was extremely poor. She only had a little tiny bit of flour, a little oil. So that the inference from that is that she had nothing to sacrifice to God. She was in this sacrificial culture but had nothing of value to give to God. And then the implication of that is that her sins hadn't been dealt with via the sacrificial system because she had nothing to offer. And perhaps because the man of God was there, that drew God's attention to her lack of sacrifice, and God now was going to get what he wanted, and he took the life of her son. That kind of thinking, that when I get around somebody that I consider more holy than I, or more in tune with God than I am, that's going to somehow draw God's attention to what's wrong in me. It's kind of like people that hide all their liquor when the pastor comes to visit, you know? They feel like, it always puzzled me because, like, do they think God doesn't see that they have the liquor before the pastor gets there, or what is it? But, you know, I don't have a problem if you drink. You don't have to hide your liquor if I come. But anyway, this widow, I think, thought sacrificially about God. She thought that God required sacrifice, and the implication was because she was so poor, she didn't have anything to offer to God, and God therefore took her son. Or if we don't create our own sacrificial offerings or our own sacrificial victims, God will take something precious to us. In other words, he's going to get his sacrifice either way, whether we offer it to him or he takes it. So that's how I think she thought. And we see inferences and see some of it directly in the text, but also if you just add to it what we know of the culture, this is how people tended to think. Now, how did Elijah think about all this? In verse 19, Elijah says to her, "Give me your son." This is after her son had passed away. He took him from her bosom, carried him up into the upper chamber where he was lodging, and laid him on his own bed. He cried out to the Lord, "O Lord my God, have you brought calamity or evil," a lot of translations say, "even upon the widow with whom I am staying, by killing her son?" So Elijah starts inquiring of God, asking. There is no punctuation in Hebrew, so the grammar tends to lead most translators to pose this as a question. When Elijah speaks to God, although we don't know the way the sentence is constructed, most translations put a question mark at the end. So Elijah is inquiring. In other words, he thinks God is capable of killing, or God is capable of evil in this case. But he's not sure if this is what's going on, so he inquires of God about it. He clearly thought God was capable of taking the widow's son, but he's not sure, and he certainly is not okay with it. Even if God did it, he's not okay with it. Why? Because she'd been caring for him. After she made that first little cake for him, and Elijah miraculously provided for her food after that, she cared for him. She made food for him for some period of time. So Elijah takes the boy into an upper room, and there he stretched himself upon the child 3 times and cried out to the Lord, "O Lord my God, let this child's life come into him again." The Lord listened to the voice of Elijah. The life of the child came back into him again, and he revived. Elijah took the child, brought him down from the upper chamber into the house, and gave him to his mother. Then Elijah said, "See, your son is alive." So even though Elijah thought God was capable of taking the son's life, he contended with God over it. He contended for the boy's life, laid on the child 3 times, cried out to God, and the child came back alive. So in this kind of sacrificial culture, how would people think about this story? How would they interpret it or understand it? Perhaps it would be something like this. God was angry with the widow for her sins and for not bringing suitable sacrifices. God then took the life of her young son to appease himself, an involuntary sacrifice, if you will. Elijah then, a man of God who has some pull with God, then pleads with God to restore the boy's life, and God does. He restores the boy's life. Then we see the response of the widow. So the woman said to Elijah, "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord is in your mouth is true." Or, I understand that you have a connection with God that I don't have. You have the ability to change God's mind. You have the ability to make a change in circumstances. Or in other words, this story really tells us that Elijah had more compassion than God did. That Elijah was more compassionate in this circumstance than God was in the type of thinking of the ancient Near East. Or the widow has her son back because of Elijah in spite of God. You could think of it that way. Elijah appears more compassionate than God in this story. But Elijah is also a dangerous person to have around, because she thinks it was the presence of Elijah that drew God's attention to the fact that she hadn't been sacrificing and caused the death of her son in the first place. But he was also able to get God to restore her son. So prophets are a thorny bunch. They're a group of people that it's nice to have them around in the right circumstances, but it's not so good to have them around in other circumstances. We're not sure what Elijah thought about all of this. We see that he didn't think that the boy should die. So he contended with God to get the boy back to life. So he brings life into this situation of death. But then the very next thing he does is goes and challenges the prophets of Baal to a showdown and brings death to a much bigger situation. So Elijah is clearly a man of the times, where he's conflicted about the nature of God. He doesn't know when God is taking out people for sure, and when it's his responsibility to act like that, and when it's his responsibility to bring life into a situation. So let's contrast this with the New Testament story of the Widow of Nain in Luke 7. There are some similarities in this story. Another widow who has a son who has died, and they're in a funeral procession, and Jesus comes along. Verse 11 says, "Soon afterwards, Jesus, went down to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went with him. As he approached the gate of the town, a man who had died was being carried out. He was his mother's only son, and she was a widow, and with her was a large crowd from the town." So there's a lot of echoes to the Elijah story. A widow, her only son has died, and the man of God comes along. When the Lord saw her, he had compassion for her and said to her, "Do not weep." Then he came forward and touched the bier, and the bearers stood still. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, rise." The dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother. So like the Elijah story, Jesus restores the boy to health, but this widow had not been doing anything for Jesus prior to this. Where the widow in the Zarephath story had been caring for Elijah, meeting his needs, cooking for him and so forth, and giving him a place to stay, this is a complete stranger to Jesus. Jesus just happens onto this funeral procession and heals the boy. They didn't even know each other. And Jesus doesn't plead with God about it. Where Elijah pled with God and wasn't sure, sort of had a question about whether the death of the son was God's work or not. He pled with God about it. Jesus doesn't plead with God about it. He just says, "Young man, I say to you, rise." So Jesus is not conflicted then about what God might want. He doesn't question about whether God took the life of this boy or not. He just sees it as a bad thing, and he steps in to remedy that. He just speaks to the boy, commands him to rise from the dead, and he does. So where the Widow of Zarephath story was heavy with sacrificial overtones, we see it, if you read between the lines, you see all kinds of sacrificial thinking in it. And it took place at a time and a place that was saturated in that kind of thinking about the gods. The time of Jesus was also like that. The community still thought very sacrificially at the time. The whole temple sacrificial system was in place, and the Jews were saturated in that way of thinking. So I'm proposing that there's a clue in this story of Jesus healing the widow of Nain's son that is intended to lead us out of thinking sacrificially about God. More than just what we've talked about so far. More than just the fact that Jesus didn't even know this family. He doesn't question whether it was God's will or not. He just heals the young boy. And the clue lies in the word that's translated compassion. The word in our New Testament, compassion, comes from that fancy Greek word, splachnizomai. Splachnizomai. Everybody try that. Splachnizomai. Sounds like he just made a mess on the table or something, doesn't it? But that's what it is. Splachnizomai is translated 12 times in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, as compassion. It's often translated compassion, and we see it in stories just before Jesus heals somebody. It said, moved with compassion, he healed them. You've probably read a lot of those stories. It happens both times before Jesus feeds the multitude. It says he was moved with compassion and he fed the multitudes. Jesus also directly used the word 3 times himself in 3 of his parables. In the prodigal son, it says the father, when he saw the son returning, was moved with compassion and ran to his son. In the Good Samaritan story, the Good Samaritan was moved with compassion when he saw the man lying on the road who had been beaten and left for dead. And in the unforgiving servant parable, the master had compassion on the unforgiving servant and forgave his debt. So, compassion was a driving force in how Jesus responded to people who were suffering. Over and over again in those Synoptic Gospels, we see that. Their suffering could have been sickness, could have been disease, birth defect, poverty, hunger, demonic possession, slavery, abuse, debt, or estrangement. Any of those kind of sufferings, Jesus would respond to with compassion. So we can say that when Jesus saw suffering, he responded with compassion. Everybody think that's an okay thing to say. So, but what makes the use of this Greek word so interesting is prior to its use in the Synoptic Gospels, it didn't mean what we understand it to mean today. You know how we say, oh, that's bad, and we really mean it's good? It's kind of like that. You know, that's a bad, that guy is so bad. We mean he's awesome, you know. This is almost the nature of Splachnizomai. So here is an Aztec sacrificial ceremony. You've probably heard about Aztecs. When they did human sacrifice, they would actually cut the heart out of a human sacrifice. This didn't originate with the Aztecs. This happened in Greco-Roman, ancient Near Eastern cultures as well. From the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, under the heading for compassion, you can read this. The Greek word for compassion, splachnizomai, has a very interesting history. The noun form, splachna, was used in the earliest Greek literature to designate the inner parts of the sacrificial victim ripped out during a ritual blood sacrifice. If the heart was cut out during the ritual, for example, it was called a splachna, not a cardia. So there was another Greek word, cardia, where we get the word cardiac, meaning heart or heart troubles. They had another Greek word called cardia that could have referred to the heart, but in the sacrificial context, the heart that was taken out during sacrifice was called a splachna, which is the word that is translated compassion in these 12 occurrences in the New Testament. Later, it became a generic term for the inner organs, including the womb. It also was seen as the seat of the impulsive passions, such as anger or anxious desire. It was never used in the pre-Christian Greek world to mean mercy or compassion, as it came to mean in the later Jewish Christian writings. So the Gospels subvert the Greek word splachnizomai, which had to do with the inner parts of a sacrificial victim, into a word that we understand to mean mercy, compassion, pity, kindness, or charity. Isn't that interesting? To subvert something is to overthrow it. You often hear of the word subversive in the context of a political situation where maybe there's an unjust leadership in a country, but they're the legitimate legal authority, but another group comes along and subverts or is subversive against that authority. So subversion means to change something completely, and in this case, it's a changing of a definition, sort of. The New Testament, I think, is the record of the subversion of the overthrowing of entire sacrificial religious systems. So to illustrate how this has changed, Eugene Peterson caught this in his translation of the word splachnitzima. And in another passage where it's used in the Good Samaritan story, Eugene Peterson translates splachnitzima this way. A Samaritan traveling the road came on him. When he saw the man's condition, his heart went out to him. He gave him first aid, disinfecting and bandaging his wounds. His heart went out to him. But instead of it meaning the violent removal of a sacrificial victim's heart, the gospel meaning subverts that into the Samaritan's heart going out in compassion to a suffering victim. The New Testament gospel, or the good news, is that God requires mercy, not sacrifice. And it's so embedded in it, it's in the subversion of the actual language that's used in the New Testament. The sacrifice that God requires in the New Testament is self-sacrificial love toward others, especially toward those that are suffering. We see it in context. 12 times it's used in that context in the Gospels. God doesn't ask us to try to appease him with offerings. He just asks us to be Jesus to suffering people. The subversion of language in the New Testament, it's very important to pay attention to. See, if we continued to understand splachnitzima the way the Greeks did before the New Testament, we would feel justified in sacrificing all those whom Jesus healed and delivered, because that's how the word was used prior to that. So this is why, I just want to talk about hermeneutics a little bit, because we do this, why the law of first mention often doesn't work. Has anybody ever heard of the law of first mention? If you've studied hermeneutics, it's one of 4 or 5 principles that a lot of Bible schools teach about how to understand the Bible. Another, and I'll illustrate it this way, another word that's been subverted in the New Testament. Well, actually, let's start with this. Here's the law of first mention. The very first time any important word is mentioned in the Bible, Scripture gives that word its most complete and accurate meaning. That's the law of first mention from the Net Bible Study website. There are numerous other places you can find it, and they're all pretty similar to that. This can sometimes be true, but it certainly doesn't acknowledge the full and complete revelation of God that we have in Jesus. So it's problematic. It can in fact cause students to take the words of Jesus and make them bow to the words of Moses, Elijah, and other Old Testament saints. The law of first mention is also actually impossible to practice, because we don't know in many cases which books were written before other books, and even within the books they're often talking about historic things. So how can you actually practice it? I think it's impossible to practice, unless you just use it to validate your own opinions on words. Then you can use it that way if you'd like, but some apply it just according to the sequential order of the books in the Bible, but the sequential order is not the chronological order of which they were written, and there's endless debate about a lot of these books, when they were written, and when even parts, like Isaiah, scholars divide into 3 parts, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Isaiah, with different authors and different time periods. So that law of first mention is problematic. I'll just leave it with that. So another word that's been subverted in the New Testament that illustrates this is the word apostle. It's the Greek word apostolos. Jesus didn't make this word up. It existed. It was a Greek word, and it existed before Jesus even was around. It usually referred to a person like an admiral on a fleet of ships in the Roman Empire. And the way the Roman Empire expanded, it would send ships or cross land into a new region, and this apostle of the empire would go to the leaders of the community, to the city, for instance, and he'd say, "Welcome, the Caesar, Lord Caesar sends his greetings, and we would like to give you an opportunity to join the Roman Empire. And here's your opportunity. If you choose to join, great. You can bow to Caesar, you can pay taxes to Caesar, and you can join the Roman Empire. If not, we'll kill you all." That was the choice. Hail Caesar. That's right. So you can see how and he was backed up by a fleet of ships. You saw a lot of cities converted to Romans and became members of the Roman Empire. Now, in modern periods, though, there's an apostolic movement. You guys have heard about it back at Abundant Life Church. There's this apostolic movement that I was on the fringes of, but I always had problems with it. And it was launched basically by a group called a movement called the New Apostolic Reformation, NAR for short, back in the 30s and 40s. And the tendency in that movement was to not just seek out the first biblical use of a word, and then use it to understand what's going on in the New Testament, but they also would extend it to how was this word used outside the Bible. So when you come across a word like apostle, and people were trying to bring the office of apostle, or the fivefold ministry of apostle, into modern times, they went looking for early Greek meanings for the word apostle, and they happened across this meaning. Apostle meant like an admiral or a commander who would go and expand the Roman Empire with force. Now, I don't know any of these apostles that have actually counseled churches to go out and convert people at the edge of the sword, but they have created very hierarchical structures of church government and apostolic oversight of churches that are very similar to how apostle was used pre-Jesus, that paid no attention to how Jesus used the word. In other words, they extended the law of first mention outside the scriptures to the surrounding culture and used those definitions to justify how they're implementing apostolic ministry today. The problem with that is in Hebrews 3, Jesus is called our apostle. And when Jesus chose his apostles, what did he do? He washed their feet. He didn't threaten them with their lives. And he counseled them to do the same for the people that they would lead. And Hebrews 3 refers to Jesus this way: "Therefore, brothers and sisters, holy partners in the heavenly calling, consider that Jesus, the apostle and high priest of our confession," so Jesus is our apostle, "was faithful to the one who appointed him, just as Moses also was faithful in all God's house. Yet Jesus is worthy of more glory than Moses, just as the builder of a house has more honor than the house itself." So the author of Hebrews says Moses was faithful. Now, did Moses do everything exactly right? No, Moses didn't do everything right. But he was faithful in the context of the time and place that he lived. To the extent that he knew to be faithful, he was faithful. But the writer also says that Jesus is worthy of more glory than Moses. He is our apostle. So again, using the law of first mention to define what an apostle looks like, and by disregarding what Jesus taught us about being an apostle, is problematic. Is not a good way to do it, I don't think. Jesus is our example of a subverted apostleship. He takes that picture. Isn't it interesting that in a time and place where everybody would be afraid of apostles, and that they represented what could be the worst of the empire. I mean, there were good things about the empire too. It brought peace to the region. It was peace through power and strength, but it also apostles were fearsome characters, kind of like Elijah was perceived at the time. But Jesus doesn't take life, he gives it. And if he's our apostle, he should be our model of apostleship. Jesus doesn't demand sacrifice for God. He sacrifices himself for people. Jesus doesn't expand his kingdom through violent conquest. He expands his kingdom through love, compassion, and forgiveness. So when we define apostles today, we ought to use, I think, the example of Jesus, not the pre-Christian definition of that word. The New Testament, and to a lesser extent the Old Testament, is a record of a gradual move away from sacrificial religion toward the gospel. these two stories of two widows and their sons, I think, can help us illustrate this transformation in our understanding of God. Not through the law of first mention, but through the law in the lens of love. Anyway, that's what I have to say about those two stories today.